Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all here, as close as here as we can be these days. My name is Matt Clark. I'm a member of the Detroit chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, and we're here for the event, Is the Two-State Solution Dead? The Future for Democracy and Equal Rights in Palestine, in Israel. I want to thank, first of all, our supporters. We have a few very good organizations that are working with us on this particular event. The Birmingham Temple Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, Detroit Solidarity, Central United Methodist Church, Huntington Woods Peace Group, the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, the Meta Peace Team, Michigan Coalition for Human Rights, Peace Action of Michigan, Moratorium Now Coalition, One Hamtramck, Swords into Plowshares, Peace Center and Gallery, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. I would also like to thank our moderator, Rabbi Jeffrey Falick, who I will introduce shortly. We'll begin by telling you a little bit about Jewish Voice for Peace, our organization, and in particular our Detroit chapter. Jewish Voice for Peace is a diverse and democratic community of activists inspired by Jewish tradition to work together for peace, social justice, and human rights. JVP is a Jewish group, but of course you don't have to be Jewish to join, and we encourage anyone who wants to work with us on these issues to join us. Of course, we host all sorts of events like this one, educational events, intellectual exchanges. We do street level actions, solidarity actions with Palestinian-led organizations and other organizations that are doing similar work and organizations that we support. We hold monthly organizing meetings open to all members, and we please consider that you join us. We'd love to have you. I will post a link in the chat for anybody who's interested, and as well as our email, detroit@jvp.org, for anyone who would like to get involved. Jewish Voice for Peace, a little bit about our organization. We were the first major U.S. Jewish group to call for an end to the U.S. military aid to Israel until it ends occupation. The only Jewish U.S. group that's a major Jewish U.S. group that supports Palestinian civil society's call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions until Israel abides by international law. And of course, we support a lot of other very good organizations and other good activists doing work on the ground in support of Black lives, in particular, the uprisings that have been going on right now. We have come out in support of them. We do all sorts of work on Israel-Palestine issue. As it relates to this particular event, Jewish Voice for Peace does not take a particular position on the one or two state solution. We support any solution that's consistent with the full rights of both Palestinians and Israeli Jews. And we're delighted to have today a panel of distinguished speakers who are going to talk about these issues. And we thank everyone for being here for this important conversation. And feel free to post questions on the chat. I'm going to introduce very quickly our moderator, Rabbi Jeffrey Falick, who is a rabbi at the Birmingham Temple Congregation for Humanistic Judaism. He and his congregation are active locally and nationally in many social justice efforts. He's also certified as a senior humanist celebrant by the American Humanist Association and is president and founder of the Humanists of Southeast Michigan. With that, I'd like to hand everything over to our moderator, Rabbi Jeffrey Falick.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you to JVP for asking me to be part of this program. This is a little bit of deja vu for some of us, because you may recall, those of you in the Southeast Michigan area, that we did something in a similar vein 2.5 years ago at my congregation. It was under different sponsorship and so forth, but we did hear at that time from Dr. Roth, and we heard from Ms. Arraf. So it's a pleasure once again to join them. And I know Fred, Dr. Pearson from the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights. So it's an honor to be here, and I wanted to begin by saying that. I also, before I make a few preliminary remarks, I want to spend a moment thinking about someone who is not with us tonight. Some of you, hopefully all of you, have heard the name at some point over the last decades, Saeb Erekat. Saeb Erekat was the longtime chief negotiator for the PLO, a man dedicated to peace. I had the honor and the privilege of meeting him over 20 years ago. He died within this just last month of COVID. It was very, very sad to see such an outstanding advocate for his people leave us that way. He demonstrated care and respect for everyone. His death, I think, was a tremendous loss. And I think that as this is the first time that I've been a part of a larger group of people since he died, I wanted to dedicate at least my little piece of it tonight to the goal that he set, along with his partners and on both sides of the dream of peace, I guess I'll put it, for Israel and Palestine. So I hope that his lifelong devotion to peace will be an inspiration to all of us. So last summer, in the pages of Jewish Currents magazine and in the New York Times, Peter Beinart, professor of journalism and political science at City University in New York, the editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, the author of Crisis of Zionism, wrote this: about 640,000 Jewish settlers now live in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. The Israeli and American governments have divested Palestinian statehood of any real meaning. He went on to talk about the Trump plan, such as it was, and continued by saying that, well, in practice, Israel has already annexed the West Bank a long time ago. Israel has all but made its decision, one country that includes millions of Palestinians who lack basic rights. I think it's important for us to understand that the de facto situation in Israel is already of one state. And while there are very well-intentioned voices on every side of this issue, alongside many who are not so well-intentioned, I think that that's a reality that we have to work from. When we met 2.5 years ago at my congregation, we had the opportunity to learn some new words from Dr. Roth that we will probably hear tonight. One of them was the idea of a consociational form of government. And I know that he'll be addressing that tonight. It has become something much more discussed since that night in May, 2.5 years ago, because this is the very word that Mr. Beinart used in describing what he sees as a possible future under one state. So let me just now, having said those words and why this is so important, talk about the format tonight. We're going to give each panelist 10 minutes to speak. And then afterwards, they'll each have 5 minutes to respond to each other's presentations. So you can add up and see how we're going. During this time, please put your questions in the chat feature. I know it's a convenient place to also say hi to everybody, so maybe type in capital letters question or something, so that as Michael Friedman and Matt go through the questions, they'll at least be able to spot that right away. We only have about 20-25 minutes for the questions, and the folks at JVP have prepared some as well. So we may not get to them all, and we apologize in advance, but that's probably the best we can do without going the time that we need for this, which is not 20 minutes, but 20 weeks or more to cover this topic appropriately. So let's talk about our panelists very briefly. I'm going to introduce only in the slightest of terms the two that will be speaking subsequently, and they are in reverse order. Ms. Huwaida Arraf. She is a Palestinian American human rights attorney and activist, the co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement, and I will give her a more appropriate introduction in a few moments. Dr. Frederick Pearson, who will speak second, is the director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, as well as being a professor of political science and the Gershenson Distinguished Faculty Fellow at Wayne State University. And leading us off for the first 10 minutes will be Dr. Brad Roth. Dr. Roth is a professor of political science and law at Wayne State University in Detroit. He holds a JD from Harvard University, a master's of law in international and foreign law from Columbia, and then just to mix things up, he left the Ivy League in order to receive his PhD in jurisprudence. I think I might have mixed up your degrees there, Dr. Roth, but in jurisprudence and social policy, that came from UC Berkeley. He is the author of numerous books, of chapters and books, of articles and commentaries dealing with questions of sovereignty, constitutionalism, human rights, and democracy. He is acknowledged as a leading expert on international law, the international law of recognition of states and governments. He served from 2010 to 2018 as one of 3 American branch representatives to the International Law Association's Committee on Recognition, Non-Recognition of States and Governments. His CV and his accomplishments are so much longer than we have time for, and we don't want to take time away from his presentation. So I'm going to turn it over for the next 10 minutes to Dr. Bradley Roth.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. First, I'd like to sort of take a page out of your book and remember someone this evening who is quite relevant to this. We lost in September Meron Ben-Venisti, who was the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem. His son happens to be a leading international law scholar, teaches at the University of Cambridge. Ben-Venisti was one of the first leading Zionists to come to the position that Peter Beinart has come to. And he came to that position way back in the 1980s. In an interview in 2012, he made some extraordinarily provocative remarks. He said that this is master nation democracy in Israel. In German, a Herrenvolk democracy. We are a country that behaves like a full-blooded democracy, but we have a group of serfs, the Arabs, to whom we do not apply democracy. The result is a situation of extreme inequality. The only solution, he said, is to incorporate Palestinians into the state on conditions of equality. And for him, that meant sharing power while maintaining separate cultural identities through a framework that he did not deign to try to specify, because that was going to be clearly a product of the working out of long political processes. But Ben-Venisti was someone who I think very much anticipated the kinds of circumstances that we find ourselves in today. And many of the rest of us have been slower to come to his realization, but have gotten there. I can't speak for Peter Beinart. I have never met him, and he certainly has not appointed me as his spokesperson. But he and I have, in some ways, traveled parallel paths. I'm 9 years older than he is, actually. The path that I have traveled, I think, is relevant to all of this in the following way. I was back at Hebrew University in Jerusalem a couple of years ago in 2018, and I found that myself in an interesting situation. I had been there 35 years before as a student in between my junior and senior year in college at Hebrew University in 1983. When I was there in 1983, Israel was 35 years old and the occupation was 16 years old. When I returned in 2018, Israel was 70 years old and the occupation was 51 years old. And of course, we're 2 years beyond that now. The relevance of that really struck me because when you thought about these issues back in 1983, it was still possible to see the occupation as being somehow exceptional, that it was not part of the essence of the state of Israel. Indeed, that the state of Israel was premised on entirely different principles, that this was an expedient imposed upon the Israeli state by circumstances of armed conflict, and that we should not understand the Israeli national project as being in any way tainted by this phenomenon. Fast forward. Right now, of course, as the rabbi has pointed out, 650,000 Jewish Israelis live on the wrong side of the Green Line, about 210,000 of them in the expanded East Jerusalem, which is beyond the scope of what used to be called Jerusalem, but it basically extends all the way from Ramallah to Bethlehem. These people are excluded from the numbers that are ordinarily referred to, indeed, under international law, settlers. And we have a very peculiar conceptual framework that's applied to this situation, where one talks about the Green Line, and people speak of this as having some significance or not, and being a border or not. But the bottom line is that from the Israeli perspective, it is a unidirectional border. What's ours is ours beyond cavil. What's yours may also be ours. And so we'll negotiate about that. And by the way, the longer it takes you to cry uncle and yield to us peace on the terms that we dictate, the less and less you're going to have, because we're going to continue to create facts on the ground in the course of these endless negotiations. Back in 1983, I became involved with an organization called the America-Israel Council for Israeli-Palestinian Peace. At that time, advocating as Zionist Jews for a solution was an extraordinarily dicey thing to be doing. We were an organization created to align with people, some very courageous people on the Israeli left who were calling for negotiations with the PLO and for a two-state solution at that time. And this was really something that placed us as outliers. We were called self-hating Jews and everything else. It's remarkable that we are, in some sense, rhetorically victims of our own success. That the two-state solution now has been largely adopted as a kind of bromide. The problem is that the two-state solution now is little more than an alibi. It has been fetishized in such a way that it no longer becomes the instrument for the establishment of mutual self-determination on equal terms, but now is essentially a kind of promissory note that everyone knows is not going to be honored. And it gives rise to a whole series of perverse consequences, because what's happened in the quest for Palestinian self-determination is that Palestinian nationhood, far from being understood in a holistic way, is fragmented in 5 different ways. We have 5 different categories of Palestinians, which makes it all the easier for Israelis to control not only the circumstances, but the discourse. So we have distinctions drawn between Arab citizens of Israel and diaspora Palestinians, and West Bank Palestinians and Gaza Palestinians, and then Palestinians who are residents of East Jerusalem, although not citizens of Israel. And so under these circumstances, it becomes possible to sort of exercise control over the situation, and not just control in a material sense, but also control in this oddly conceptual sense in which it comes to seem to be reasonable somehow that Palestinians are responsible for their own plight because they've never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity, which is to say that they've never missed an opportunity to capitulate, that their failure to forfeit claims that they have, even irreducible claims under international law, becomes used as an excuse to continue encroachment upon Palestinian territories. And so this is the fundamental problem that we face in looking at this situation. The two-state solution has largely been precluded by a series of very deliberate Israeli policies, which can be traced really from the outset of 1967, but particularly from the Likud government starting in 1977, with an effort to prevent any possibility of a true realization of a contiguous and viable Palestinian state in the territories. And therefore, we have to at least place the onus on those who assert a two-state solution as the answer to, in some sense, put up or shut up at this point. That if there is going to be a two-state solution, it has to actually fulfill the animating purposes of self-determination in international law. It has to create the conditions in which people can be genuinely self-governing and subject to a government that represents the whole population of a territory without distinction. That is a sort of thing that we do not see on the horizon at this point. Rabbi Falick talked about consociationalism. I have very little time to mention what that's about, but the idea of consociationalism is the idea of attempting to realize mutual self-determination within the framework of one state. It recognizes the fact that political equality does not boil down to majoritarianism, that under majoritarianism, 51% of the vote can lead to 100% of the power, and 49% of the people can have 0% of the power. So consociationalism creates structures in which it is possible to realize not only autonomy over local affairs for existing local communities, but various kinds of checks in the political order to see to it that no part of the political order can dominate the other. So I'm going to have to yield now, but we can talk more about these various issues as we move forward. Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Well, somebody had their timer on. Thank you.
Yes.
And I will, in case Dr. Pearson and Ms. Arraf don't have their timers on, I will let you guys know when you're getting close, but I could see that Brad was wrapping up. Our second speaker tonight to speak about the prospects for a two-state solution is Dr. Frederick S. Pearson. He is director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at Wayne State University. This is an institution noted for its innovations, degree curricula, and community service and training. In addition to his work at the center, Dr. Pearson serves as professor of political science and the Gershenson Distinguished Faculty Fellow at Wayne State. He previously has served as professor and research fellow at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and was twice a Fulbright Scholar in the Netherlands and the UK. Dr. Pearson has written widely about the Middle East conflict, civil war solutions, conflict resolution, military intervention, and arms control, among other topics. His list of recognitions is long, as is the enumeration of his contributions to international peace and nonviolence throughout his distinguished career. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Frederick Pearson.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, and thank you, Brad, for leading it off. I must say, by the way, that on consociationalism, it's a great sounding theory, but we should note Lebanon is a consociational state. Iraq today is a consociational state. Tell me about civil war in those states and whether it's been averted by the sharing of power at the, in fact, the formulaic sharing of power. President goes to one group, prime minister goes to another group, leader of the parliament goes to another group. These things do not prevent the breakdown of states or the violence of states. We wish they would. It's a good formula in a sense. We should not, we should not kid ourselves here. Any of these solutions are going to be difficult. In conflict resolution theory, we talk about prominent solutions to conflict situations. And this conflict, which has been going on in a sense since 1947, I'm going to try to share the screen here and put up a map of illustration. Hopefully you guys can see it. The conflict has been going on certainly since 47 in various forms. And there have been two basic prominent solutions posed. One being a single binational or democratic binational state, which was one of the resolutions voted on or to be voted on at the United Nations when they decided what to do with the former British control of Palestine. The other being a partition. And in the 40s, of course, partition was in fashion. That too has tremendously bad records, we must admit. We look at India and Pakistan. But partition won out in the 47 resolution for the UN partition plan of Palestine. And this is what it would have looked like. A very strange binational arrangement, two states, the Israeli state in the white, the Palestinian state in the green, coming together at very small points. You can see the potential for contention. Pakistan was also, by the way, at those days in two parts, separated by about 1,500 miles, East Pakistan, West Pakistan. And we know that today there is Bangladesh and Pakistan instead, with India having contributed to that breakup through its policies. So this is all tricky business. We come down then later to because of the warfare from the original state to the 67 borders, now mostly called the Green Line, which truncated Palestinian territory and enlarged Israeli territory, of course, and yet is seen today as still a basis for talking about a two-state solution. Certainly, UN Secretary General Guterres has not given up on a two-state solution. In fact, says that that's the only one that has international legal precedent and authority behind it, and hasn't given up on that, although one can say, well, what's the UN going to do about that? Facts have changed, as Brad pointed out, since 67, of course, more fighting, more territory, and then breaking it down into this crazy looking quilt. where we have what would have been a Palestinian state if the 1990s Oslo process had been allowed to continue and the Camp David process had reached fruition, which it was very near when Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated. By the way, I hold Netanyahu somewhat responsible for that outcome because of his unremitting hostility to the emerging agreements that were coming out of Camp David at the time between Arafat and Rabin. And it, of course, blew up, and Bill Clinton became a very, very hostile character as far as Netanyahu was concerned, and yet Netanyahu, in reverse, became very hostile to Barack Obama. The Israeli settlements have created this situation where roads and barriers, the barrier wall has separated people in towns and villages from each other. Checkpoints dot the landscape, and you have Gaza over here. A Palestinian state would, of course, need to be considered to be in two parts, with the notion of a road or something to connect them through Israeli territory, with Israel likely to be very influential in what happens along that road on both sides. So what we have is, if there's still a prospect for a two-state solution, and I think that there is, we would have to restore some of this territory. And there would have to be land exchanges, especially around the Jerusalem area. If these settlements are to continue, then there would have to be decent amounts of land exchanged to the Palestinians under agreement. A two-state solution would have to have Jerusalem as a capital for both states. I'm sorry, the Trump solution was to kick the Palestinians out of Jerusalem to some suburban area for a capital. I would like to offer the notion proposed by one of our esteemed colleagues at Harvard University, Herbert Kellman, who was a pioneer in Palestinian-Israeli dialogue and workshops. He floated the idea, he didn't flesh it out very much, but he is still a believer in the two-state solution, of the notion of two states, one country. Two states, one country, because what's happened is that modernity has caught up with these problems, but you still have competing nationalisms. You have Zionism on the one hand, which is premised on the need for a Jewish-controlled homeland, a Jewish-controlled state. The Jewish premise being we're not safe anywhere else, although I would contend with that, being an American Jew, but I have my sympathy with why that came to be as a nationalism. The other nationalism, unrequited Arab nationalism, but in particularly Palestinian nationalism, that they are a people, and like the Kurdish people, they deserve a nation state of their own to run self-government and to have self-determination. But the land situation cannot survive in this form to have a viable state unless you're looking to have treaties along the lines of the Native American treaties in the US, which are supposedly sovereign states of tribal states and reservations. But that's not a very beautiful or acceptable model, even though it had some distinction. Two states, one country would have the premise that both peoples can have their separate state apparatus, their governmental apparatus, and territory spelled out, but that they are both responsible and interested in the entire land mass of Palestine, Israel. And what has caught up with this situation is our globalized society, where the environment and climate change is going to affect both peoples, where public health and COVID has had a terrible impact on both peoples, where trade and research and development could unite these people in cooperative relationships. Indeed, because they're both highly educated peoples, they're both technologically advanced peoples, and they have a lot in common along these lines. The workforce arrangement, the tourism and the visitation possibilities. What he was spelling out is that everybody would be entitled to travel, to visit, to have relationships across these lines, but that in order to provide some semblance of security, they would need their own states. That doesn't solve the problem, of course, because security is hard won. And the Israelis about a Palestinian state have also always talked about it as disarmed, somehow disarmed. They shouldn't have armament. The Palestinians, talking about an Israeli state, which they recognize, should not be a Jewish state. They have both provided these provisos about what they will recognize in the other in the previous rounds of talks about a two-state solution, which, by the way, Netanyahu himself entered into. But the idea would be that it would be a disarmed and a harmless state, or it would not necessarily be a Jewish state on the other side. It could evolve into anything. These kinds of things have to be worked out. Whether you have a one-state solution or a two-state solution, you need to work out arrangements with people who have killed each other's families. That's something that fundamentally has to be understood by about the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. Unlike Egypt and Israel, which killed mostly the frontline troops, these two peoples have killed each other's families. They've bombed bar mitzvahs, and they've bombed children on the beaches of Gaza. They've shot Katyusha rockets into villages, and they've retaliated with major air attacks and tank attacks on Palestinian civilian areas in Gaza. But one needs to read the book, I Shall Not Hate, written by Dr. Izzeldin Abu Aleish, to understand that these two people can get along and create state relationships across the lines if given the opportunity to do so. He lost 3 children and a niece in an ungodly attack on his apartment building, and he was the first Arab doctor to practice in Israeli hospitals. And he's written this inspirational book, which talks about that we don't have to keep killing each other, but it will take reconciliation processes. It will take restitution and apology, the things we did not see when the Israelis left Gaza. They simply left and left the area to be an armed, essentially a prison camp for several million people. I want to mention pretty quickly before I leave that the public opinion polls now do show that the largest segment of support is still for a two-state solution among both people. Oddly enough, the 2018-19 poll data that I saw showed 43% on each side in favor of two-state solution. That's down from 67% in 2012. The Israelis are living in an illusion behind a wall that they're safe and they don't have to worry about it. The Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank have different views about what should happen. Both of them have still a long-term preference for doing away with Israel completely and taking the entire territory as a Palestinian state. However, significant numbers of them are pragmatic and distinguish between short and long-term goals. And the short term, just as the Iran nuclear deal, has to be given serious consideration as a step. And if we move toward 2 states, 1 country, we would have based the notion that you can gradually evolve toward a confederation, a confederal state. I would pose perhaps the United Arab Emirates as it's a different situation, but it's kind of a model of a confederation. We have separate governmental entities joined together in a confederal relationship. Ultimately, perhaps the EU can be looked at as this kind of model, but it needs to be a step-by-step process. And the first step, I would argue, is to negotiate as an acceptable relationship between 2 states, which will require an outside guarantor. That's the final point I want to make.
Just in time, Fred. Do you have just one last comment you want to make before we wrap up? A little bit over.
This relationship here and this one here clearly shows that the Palestinian state would be a tremendous disadvantage in power. It would have to be protected. Both sides would have to be protected. The United States stood in this way for the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, something we don't actually realize very much. We put troops in between the 2 states, in the Sinai passes, to say that if either one attacks the other, the US will back the attack party. Not many people realize we're on record saying we would defend Egypt against Israel if necessary. And that observation and monitoring mission is still there. It's now 13 countries involved, and they're mostly worried about terrorism, with the Egyptians involved.
So you'll have 5 minutes later to pick it up.
here. It would have to be a guaranteed two-state solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then finally, we're going to hear for 10 minutes or so from Huwaida Arraf. I just got her bio, so I'm just going to read to you what she sent me. Huwaida Arraf is a Palestinian American attorney and human rights activist, co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement, which I mentioned earlier, a Palestinian-led movement that uses nonviolent direct action to confront and challenge Israel's unlawful actions and policies on the ground in Palestine. She is the former chairperson of the Free Gaza movement, which in 2008 sailed the first 2 boats across the Mediterranean in defiance of Israel's blockade on the people of Gaza. She was one of the primary organizers of the Gaza Freedom Flotilla and was sailing with it when it was lethally attacked. You may recall in 2010 when the Israeli Navy attacked it, and there were deaths as a result. I'll mention I was in Israel at the time, and it was a horrible thing to see. She currently practices law and organizes in Detroit. Recently, Huwaida served as 2020 Bernie Sanders delegate to the Democratic National Convention. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Huwaida, for 10 minutes of your comments.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I want to thank my fellow co-panelists for their contributions. So I'm going to jump right in because 10 minutes is not a lot of time, and I tend to go off on tangents. When I was asked to participate in this because there was going to be a discussion about Peter Beinart's change of heart or talking about a one-state solution and what is my reaction to that, my first reaction was, Palestinians have been talking about this for a long time, and now that a Jewish American is talking about it, it's getting a lot of play. But that's kind of how I guess we've gotten used to that, in that, Palestinians kind of scream and shout about things, but we're not really given a lot of agency or listened to. But it is significant that Peter Beinart, who is a very respected commentator and academic and a longtime commentator on Israel-Palestine in particular, has changed his views and is being talked about and is generating a conversation within the Jewish community. I mean, I definitely think that's great. But my point is that Palestinians have been talking about the one-state solution for decades. It was actually the original position of the Palestine Liberation Organization for a very long time. And it slowly began to change. And then with the Oslo Accords, the Palestinians officially adopted this idea of 2 states or a Palestinian state on 22% of our homeland, which for the majority of Palestinians, it was accepted as possibly a solution to get us closer to our rights and some kind of freedom. But for a lot of Palestinians and some very well-respected Palestinians, probably foremost being Dr. Edward Said, the late Edward Said, were very critical, and Palestinians continue to talk about the one-state solution. And one state being recognizing the reality that Israel exists, but why don't we settle for a solution where everybody that is on this land or wants to live in this land lives with equal rights, and that rights aren't given based on race or ethnicity or religion. And even, over the past couple of decades, I think we've been hearing the 2-state solutions dying. The 2-state solution is on its last leg. The 2-state solution is dead. It's buried. We've put the final nail. I would say it's not only dead for a long time, but it's completely disintegrated, and it is completely, it is unuseful to continue to harp and talk about it. And not only because of the practicalities, because of what Israel has created on the ground, but because the 2-state solution that was talked about, that was envisioned by Israelis when the Oslo Accords were signed, in 93, and what Israelis continued to do after, was never based on equal rights. There was never a rights-based approach. International human rights, humanitarian law were never at the center of the negotiation process of the Oslo Accords, of everything that came after. In fact, it was seen as a hindrance to negotiations to bring up international law. And so my position has not been to advocate for the one-state solution necessarily, though I think it probably is time that I do more vocally, but it's always been to have a rights-based approach to whatever end to the situation we are going to envision, because we can't be talking about anything less than something that will ensure the equal rights, the human rights, the basic rights of everybody that is involved, because that's not going to lead to a lasting peace. That's not going to lead to Israel's security. Israel cannot maintain its security by oppressing other people or denying other people their rights. And I speak about it from, just to give an example, I would say if a Palestinian state, in the West Bank and Gaza came tomorrow, the struggle wouldn't be over for the majority of Palestinians. And for me specifically, because my village falls inside of the, 1948, what is now Israel. It was taken over in 1948. I am a citizen of Israel, but I am not considered to have equal rights. I am undesired. I'm a barely tolerated, forced minority. And so to continue to be discriminated against on the land of my ancestors, just because there's a Palestinian state, and the answer to that might be, well, we'll go live in the Palestinian state. That is not a solution for me. And so the whole premise for me from the beginning was not acceptable. And then if you talk about in Israel, which we are calling for, if there's going to be a two-state solution, both states must guarantee equal rights for everybody, not in any way based on what religion you are. And for Israel, that is unacceptable, because that would mean the complete abolition of laws that are put in place and practices designed to keep Israel as a majority Jewish state. And I don't have time to go through them, but there are about 60 laws on Israel's books that discriminate against Palestinians, and that are intended to ensure that even though Palestinian citizens of Israel serve in the parliament, they have no ability to affect the change of any of these laws, and they continue to be passed and they continue to be implemented. As we know, the infamous Jewish nation state law being, more recently just kind of just kind of throwing it in your face what Israel is about and what it wants to be. It doesn't really want Palestinians there. And this brings me to a point that, we've been talking about for decades, the occupation, but I have been arguing that and I'm not the only one, of course, but we need to stop talking about it as actually the occupation. Of course, Israel doesn't even consider it an occupation. As far as Israel is concerned, it is a dispute over territory. And as far as Israel is concerned, it is the rightful owner of this land, or it belongs to them. But as far as the international community is concerned, this is occupation. But if we look at, and there are some brilliant authors and Israeli historians and Palestinian historians that have actually gone through the archives, and you look at what the intention of the Israeli state was from the beginning, we are talking about a settler colonial project. And if you are going to deal with a settler colonial project, the solution to that is not to negotiate some kind of deal where the colonial power can maintain, the supremacy and what the Palestinians or the colonized people might accept. It is to start a process of decolonizing. And that's not being talked about. And I think that we need to get there. And that process of decolonization must include also, an understanding of the harms that have been done. We heard talk about Truth and Reconciliation Committee and other things, but without that kind of intense work being done and ensuring that the rights of all people that have been involved, especially the Palestinian refugees and their right to come home. For example, a two-state solution also that is envisioned and talked about would not include Palestinian refugees getting the right to come home, of course, because that would disrupt Israel's demographic majority, and that's also a problem. Without ensuring the right of refugees to come home and to receive compensation, you have not addressed the situation here. And I'm not trying to put across it's going to be easy. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but it is the more practical solution. It is a solution that will actually see that prosperity for both people, the end of, even I would argue, the end of a moral rot, I think, that has infested the Jewish-Israeli population, and that has allowed these policies to continue, where it's okay to oppress Palestinians like this, and they don't even have to think about it. A disturbing number of Jewish Israelis could care less about what's happening to the Palestinian people and support it. And that is a form of oppression that the acceptance of which is, I think, really rots the soul. And so if we're going to talk about, so I was starting to say that it's the more practical solution, not easy, no solution is easy, but when you deal with these issues and are working towards an outcome where everybody is treated equally, then not only will you have respect human rights, ensure equality, you will be more likely to succeed in having a prosperity, having both nations prosper. And this is not to say that the economic disparity and other things right now won't be a problem. Sure, they will, but you can build towards actually both societies thriving. It's the only way to ensure really the long-term success and safety and security of Jews in Israel, which is really what they want, but they want it by oppressing Palestinians as opposed to by treating Palestinians as equal. So to maintain this kind of ethno-religious superiority, which comes along with a lot of oppression and denial of human rights, is not going to work in the long term. And so I say, what is wrong with everybody living together with equal rights? What is wrong with, in Israel, adopting and pushing for, or even American Jews here, pushing for the same vision that we advocate for and that we are proud of, well, not without its problems here in the United States, of course, but when we talk about democracy and human rights and equal rights for all, but when we have problems seeing it, when it means that Jewish Israelis might lose power and supremacy, that becomes problematic. I don't know where I am on time, but just so I stress
We're
again.
a little bit over, but go ahead.
Okay, so then I will end it by saying that it's going to be difficult, whatever solution there is, but there can't be a solution where one group of people is preferred or decides or insists on maintaining any kind of superiority, dominance over another people, and where other people here, the victims, the Palestinians, are not given their complete human, basic human rights. And that's unfortunately what the two-state solution has meant for the last couple of decades. And one final thing to Dr. Pearson, I appreciated your comments. The only thing is, like, if you want to advocate for a two-state solution, or anyone that wants to advocate for a two-state solution, I disagree because of what I laid out here. But the problem that we have is those who have been advocating for two-state solution have not, and I don't know, Dr. Pearson, about you, but they have not put anything behind it. They have not fought for it. And fighting for it, meaning pressuring Israel to actually not consistently take steps that could totally undermine it. That means being very supportive of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the large global nonviolent Palestinian-led movement that is intended to put pressure on Israel to recognize Palestinian human rights. And so if you want a two-state solution, then be at the forefront of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement to actually put pressure on Israel to assure some kind of fair solution that is based on that. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Huwaida, for your eloquent and I think importantly personal understanding of the situation. I've been given 5 minutes to do my own little response before we return. I have to say that I identify, and I apologize for this being very Judeo-centric, but that's who I am. I am a Judeo, but in all seriousness, I identify very much with what Peter Beinart wrote about. Because I too wanted, for all kinds of reasons, partly fear-based. Many Jews and Israelis speak out of fear, and it's historical fear, The Holocaust can't be denied, though the Palestinians were certainly not in any way responsible for it, despite certain kinds of propaganda that goes out that's ridiculous. But it does stem from fear, and that fear has extended towards Palestinians who should be properly regarded as neighbors and friends and citizens of equal status and equal rights and deserving in every way. What I think people like Peter Beinart and I came into our Zionism through was this idea of a Jewish, as Dr. Roth spoke about, a place where Jewish culture could flourish on our terms, Jewish solidarity and Jewish togetherness and all that kind of thing. And it did create and continues to create not only a willful blindness, but an almost incredibly, it seems to be almost biological blindness on the part of Israelis. And I know not a few of them, some of them are very dear and family to me, on their part, to see what's really happening here, to understand the situation of the Palestinians, to understand what the decisions of their own government have caused. And I think that what Beinart and some other Jewish people have done is they've looked at this and said, this is not working. It's not going to happen. It's not providing any kind of security for the Jews. It's not providing any kind of human rights or move towards equality and an egalitarian society for the Palestinians. And now we look at the maps and we're befuddled that anyone could possibly think that there would be a way to pry these people apart. I am famously known for my decision to advocate for human rights, however the two parties can come to it in an equitable way. I don't belong to anybody's organizations anymore because I've spent time on every side of the issue. And because of that, I've decided that the issue has to be, ultimately has to come to the two parties coming together. But I fear that the one with the upper hand is not going to be willing to do it for a long time. And I do urge, from a human rights point of view, people in the Jewish community and in other well-meaning communities to make it heard in the corridors of power, but not just there, among Israelis in particular and American Jews, that what they are seeing is not what is happening. What they are seeing is it's with blinders on. They do not understand what Palestinians deal with. They do not understand life in the West Bank. They do not understand life for Palestinian citizens of Israel. They do not understand what the basic laws, this nation state law did to Palestinians. Heck, it did it to Druze, the Druze population, so loyal to the Zionist cause and to the Israeli government, serving in prominent positions. They themselves found themselves outside of any kind of consensus of who or what they are in the country, this most loyal of loyal minorities, when this law was passed. So I would urge, and it's the reason that I agreed to do this this moderation, I would urge that we listen very carefully to Ms. Arraf and to other Palestinians who are telling their story in an emotional and human way. For all of the history that we have to slice through, and there's a lot of it, and there are good and bad arguments on both sides, most of it does not relate to what the daily situation is of Palestinians and how it is utterly ignored by Israelis. You see Israelis out in the streets protesting Netanyahu. Do not think for a moment that has anything to do with the Palestinians. The average Israeli is thinking about the Palestinians as often as I think about the average Martian. So I'm going to turn it over at this point to Brad with his 5-minute response. And then we will proceed, I guess, in the order that we did it in, to Fred, and then following that once again to Huwaida.
There is so much to grapple with here, and I want to thank all of my fellow panelists for the things that they have said. I think that many of the things that Huwaida has said are really crucial to orienting this discussion. Because first of all, we need to be concerned about the ways in which the whole discussion about partition has excluded the conditions of Palestinian refugees from 1948. The whole problem of how to implement UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which is long forgotten, about the repatriation of Palestinians. And so this is one of the serious problems with maintaining the focus on partition. There's also, as Professor Pearson has conceded, the partition plans have also, just like consociational plans, foundered in many respects. Nagorno-Karabakh, I guess, would be an example on the other side of this. But the real problem, I think, fundamentally is the pretense that we can maintain some notion of a Jewish and a democratic state along the lines of what's being pursued. My childhood rabbi, whom Fred knows, Israel Dresner, used to say that you cannot keep people down in the gutter unless you get down in the gutter with them. And the effect on Jewish values of the continued rationalization of these kinds of policies and the sort of the building momentum of more and more overtly ethno-nationalist policies over time had, I think, an incredibly corrosive effect and really something that damages not only the soul of the Jewish community, but in important ways, of course, the reputation of the Jewish community. We need to stand up for our higher values here, and they don't include what's being done in the name of Zionism. What Beinart is trying to do is to retrieve an older understanding of Zionism, one that focuses on the idea of a Jewish national home rather than the idea of a Jewish state. And this was indeed the vision of some part of the Zionist movement in earlier times. The way in which Jewish self-determination in Palestine was going to develop was very much an open question for a great deal of the period of the Zionist movement. It's true that the Zionist movement had many kind of colonialist impulses and racist understandings and so on. But there were also people within the Zionist movement who did have a vision of equality, which can, I think, be realized with some ingenuity. And we need to retrieve those traditions, and we need to understand, I think, the importance of a Jewish national home in Palestine. I do want to resist the idea that Zionism is reducible to colonialism and imperialism and so on. That's a very long discussion. I understand that it doesn't look that way from the Palestinian perspective. I wouldn't expect people to be able to internalize what so many of us as Jews understand as being so crucial about the idea of a distinctively Jewish national home. But I think that idea of a Jewish national home is reconcilable with centering human rights and international law in just the way that Huwaida discusses. I think my 5 minutes are gone.
Sorry, I was struggling to find my mute button. All right, we'll turn it now over to Dr. Pearson for your 5 minutes or so. Fred, are you accidentally muted or something?
Excuse me. I put up another shared screen to show you where the poll data are at the moment on these two peoples and their viewpoints. But as we look at this, Huwaida rightly pointed out to them about the moral rot that has occurred in Israel. By the way, I don't even know where the left has gone. It doesn't seem to be there anymore. And that's just a mystery to me. And I'm very unfortunate. I think people are living in a false illusion behind a wall. And however, there is moral rot on the Palestinian side as well. And the leadership in both Hamas and the authority in the West Bank is highly suspect among the people that they rule. And all of this process will take time. Anything we approach here has to go in steps. And that's why I say the first step might be more rationally the two-state solution. Because in the one-state solution, you think you've seen a lot of voter suppression in the United States? You ain't seen nothing yet if you have the Palestinian and Israeli state with who's going to be the majority. And the question of losing supremacy, as pointed out, or authority or power, or whatever you want to say, is going to be a major issue to overcome Yasser Arafat termed the two peoples in an interesting way in one of his books. Talked about the Palestinians as an honor people. And I think with Huwaida's points, that is coming through very strongly. They've been colonized, they've been overrun, they've been ignored, they've been trampled. The Jewish people and the Zionist Jewish element, he characterizes as a guilt people, in which people feel a burden of guilt for things like the Holocaust, for not fighting more strongly, for not standing up in a national resistance more strongly. Now that's maybe a distorted view, but I think people from Netanyahu's perspective and Jabotinsky came away extremely committed to the never take a backward step, never show weakness, and never again. And with Israelis, you have this fundamental philosophical standpoint. All of this will take a slower process of reconciliation, of getting together to overcome some of these difficulties. And I think that it has to be approached in a stepwise solution. By the way, Hamas, ironically, was backed by Israel initially and helped created by Israel initially to offset Arafat, to weaken Arafat. And that kind of thing is the kind of manipulative relationship that unfortunately will continue to exist no matter which solution, unless we get outside pressure in a very strong way by a guarantor, by the United Nations standing behind international law, which still has the resolution about partition as the valid instrument. And unless something else is passed, international law should be backed on this as much as possible. That's my viewpoint.
Thank you very much. And if you could, did you have anything else to add to that, Fred?
I do. I'm sorry. I was going to talk about the polls just briefly.
Go ahead.
You can see here that they, oddly enough, agree with each other as to the preferred solution. Apartheid is even on here as a solution for each side. It doesn't get much support, as you can see, or any. Expulsion is on here. Stronger among the Palestinians. There's distinction between Gaza and the West Bank and some of this, which we might look at. And then the two-state solution versus the one state. The Israelis, of course, have some backing of the one state, the Palestinians, and I think it's stronger actually in Gaza than it is in the West Bank. There's distrust about living in a state with Israel, with Israelis, among many Palestinians. They don't think they'll be fairly treated. They don't think they'll be equal. You'd have to convince them of that capability of the arrangement. And again, to me, it would take a step-by-step experiential, functional existence where we begin to share functions with each other. What do we do about the climate? What do we do about public health? What do we do about water? These are concrete things that they can begin to get a handle on, I believe, together.
So if you could stop sharing your screen, I will then turn it back over to Huwaida. There we go. All right, there you are. We can see you now. Go ahead, Huwaida.
Thank you. First, with regards to that poll, I was trying to see, some of you could see, I was preparing closely and trying to read which Palestinians were polled in terms of where, because as many of you probably know, less than half of the Palestinian population actually resides in historic Palestine, whether inside what's now Israel or the West Bank and Gaza. Over half live outside, and we are part also of what a solution is going to be. And so I hadn't seen that poll, but I have seen a poll, back 2 decades ago that showed Palestinian in the occupied territory that about 27 to 30% preferred a one-state solution. This was 2 decades ago. And this was phenomenal, really, because all of the Palestinian leadership at the time was only talking about a 2-state. So you didn't even know kind of what a 1-state would look like. And the only thing that was being advocated by the Palestinian leadership was a 2-state. And yet you had 27 to 30% of Palestinians in the occupied territory just hearing this all the time about 2 states, saying, no, we prefer a 1-state. And that's not even talking about Palestinians outside, which I don't have a poll to show you, but I can pretty confidently state that the majority don't see a two-state outcome. A two-state solution, really, you are talking about dealing with only that small percentage of the population that live in the West Bank and Gaza. You're not dealing, as I told you, with the Palestinians that are inside 48 that will continue to live, in the situation that they're in. You're not talking about the refugee rights. You're not talking about Palestinians that are in exile and aren't allowed to return. And it's while a lot of Palestinians of the Oslo generation, some of them might still hang on to two states. The younger generation of Palestinians, I in all of the circles that I organize in, I don't hear it. You probably hear a lot the chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And that chant means actually from the river to the sea, Palestine that is historic Palestine and everyone living in it, not distinguishing on what race you are, what religion you are, should live free, will be free. And that's what we're fighting for. That's what the younger generation that's fighting for. That's what the movements that I am a part of and the organizations that are fighting for. And I really think that will be the outcome. And that goes along with, I think I wanted to comment on also, Professor Roth, you commented that, you would hope or that the things that I talked about would not mean, the abandonment of the idea of a Jewish national home in Israel. And I would say exactly, it wouldn't at all. A Palestinian friend of mine who's also kind of an academic, he is the former executive director of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. He wrote a piece where he argued that Israelis and Palestinians should actually work together to craft a constitution that would uphold the rights of all. And this new constitution would recognize that the country would be home to both people, and that despite national narratives and voices on either side that claim otherwise, both people have historical ties to the land. It would acknowledge the Jewish people's history of being persecuted and the paramount importance of ensuring that all citizens, regardless of religion, ethnicity, or national origin, have a right to safety and security. It would recognize the wrongs done to Palestinian refugees, right, and begin a process to repatriate and compensate them. And I very much agree with that. There was a lot more points I had wanted to address, but I do also want to get some other questions in from the people that are tuning in. I think I would say that, let me just end with this point. We look at, Professor Pearson, you're arguing we have to start somewhere and with a two-state solution, and that doesn't necessarily, I don't see that. I don't see why that has to be. My experience, yes, we have, you could have radicals or people that are opposed to kind of this idea on both sides. You will always have that. But what I've seen in large part is the Palestinians being overwhelmingly welcoming to the idea of living together in peace and harmony. And just a brief example, during the height of the violence of the Second Intifada, when all of Palestinian cities were under curfew and Palestinians were being shot in the streets for daring to leave their home. A Palestinian woman shot in the street leaving a hospital. This was happening daily, and I arranged with some Israeli to bring them in. They wanted to come in to Ramallah, which I didn't think was a good idea, but they wanted to do it, and we snuck them in. And because of the privilege, quote unquote, of not being Palestinian, this group was walking in the streets of Ramallah, and Palestinians locked in their homes knew they were Israelis and were standing at their windows inviting them in for tea. Despite the violence that they were seeing, the death and the fact that they couldn't leave their home, but they knew that these Israelis came not as occupiers, but in solidarity with them, seeing their humanity, recognizing their rights, and Palestinians could look past the oppression and that these were citizens of the oppressive state and could welcome them in. And I think that is our history, and Palestinians are more than able to. I think Palestinians have actually a lot to fear the idea of living in a one state with equal rights. Palestinians, they have more to fear, I would argue, than Israelis fear for their safety and security of living in one state. But that must be all broken down by those of us that believe in that, and the work needs to start. And maybe it starts by centering equality and human rights for all, and then we can start to really kind of push for that and what that would look like. Let me end it there and turn it back over to you.
Okay,
Rabbi.
very much. Thank you all for your comments. I have here approximately 4,579 questions. So you've given me the impossible task of trying to figure out which ones. And instead, I'm going to start with my friend Barbara Harvey's question, because she sent it to me earlier this afternoon, and it's her organization, after all, that's sponsoring it. But I'm going to contract it a little bit with several other questions of the same view, and approach it from both sides, if you'll forgive me, Barbara. As we know, what happened after the withdrawal, the removal of Israeli settlers from Gaza in 2005 was not exactly a picnic. There were certainly hopes on both sides, but there were also there was also an enormous amount of violence that broke out right away. And I'm not going to characterize which side, because this is a war and both sides were involved. What, Dr. Pearson, this question was primarily for you and then for Huwaida, what's to keep these populations from not going at each other's throats should such a withdrawal? I mean, I watched the Israelis try to remove 30 settlers from Amona, what was this, 15 years ago, and they were fighting for their lives there, throwing everything they had at the Israeli military trying to remove them, and that was 2 apartment buildings. So what's to keep the two sides from not going into a kind of mass conflagration over this division into 2 states, this removal of people from one area or another, Dr. Pearson, and then I'm going to ask you to address it from your point of view of one state, Huwaida, how that would happen.
Anything that's done has to be done with a humanitarian spirit, which was totally lacking in the withdrawal from Gaza. The withdrawal from Gaza was that we don't want to bother with it anymore. It's too much of a mess. We're just taking it out. No outreach to the people in Gaza to say, oh, we're leaving some good places. Can we help you make use of them? Can we help you make use of the facilities that we had there in our settlements? Can we change the score, change the viewpoint of each other? That's what has to happen. You know, King Hussein in Jordan and President Sadat both made tremendous impressions on the enemy people, so to speak, by being human with them, by coming to their shiva in the case of King Hussein, or coming to the Knesset in the case of Sadat, excuse me. Nothing by Israeli leaders has looked like that to me. There's been no commiseration with Palestinian suffering, at least from the leadership. I'm sure there are groups that have reached out, but it has not been a conspicuous humanitarian arrangement. Let's agree to live in our separate governments, under our separate governments, but let's be civil with each other and build across the lines. Let's outreach in terms of technical assistance, in terms of reparation payments, in terms of apologies, in terms of recognition of each other's suffering. And it has to go that you pave the way toward an ultimate single state, hopefully, or at least a confederal state, by being human, by dealing with the pain.
So Huwaida, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on your. It's so hard to do.
That's been conspicuously lacking, and I think it's highly a problem for the Israeli leadership that they have not done anything along those lines. And it wouldn't be different if they were in a one state.
I want to address the same question because Barbara asked me to Huwaida, but I guess in your case it comes to how under one state do we manage this with all the hostility, I suppose, is what we're talking about from both the sort of the senior group, which is, I'm referring to them as the ones with the military, the Israelis, and the disarmed group.
I would mention my colleague Sapir Handelman. Some of you may know him. He was here in Wayne State for 2 years of postdoc, having studied with Kelman previously. He's run something called Minds of Peace among Israelis and Palestinians, both in the territories and in Israel itself, having meetings of ordinary people. They do it in the streets. They do it in front of audiences of people yelling at them. These are ordinary people who get together and negotiate about a common future. I would argue he needs to add elements of the common past, but they negotiate about a common future, and you'd be surprised how much they agree on things, of getting rid of checkpoints, or at least jointly manning them, on the limitation of settlements. All kinds of issues that he has that. And the one other point that he's trying to make is that there has to be a grassroots citizenry pushing upward against the leaders with common demands. That's lacking in Northern Ireland. There's no real reconciliation or rapprochement among the ordinary people on the two sides even today in Northern Ireland. They live apart.
I'm sorry, Fred, I want to give Huwaida a chance to respond. In your scenario of one state, how does this play out with the creation of some kind of comedy, some kind of reconciliation?
Well, first of all, let me say that I don't think that the current Israeli leadership is capable of that in any way. And you have some of the more fanatic and violent settlers also that you mentioned in laying out your question, that also would not allow it, and you don't have the government will to restrain them. And so it is currently, as far as Israel is concerned, I don't think that that is possible, which is why I think that there needs to be sustained and strong pressure on Israel and on Israeli civil society, so that civil society that Professor Pearson, you mentioned, from the bottom up will create that pressure that will change the leadership. And that is, of course, what the BDS movement is about. And, you know, when we talk about actually creating this, we envision, or I think we're thinking about kind of negotiations or the two sides coming together to agree on this. And sadly, I don't, like I said, I don't think the Israeli leadership is capable. And that is to say that I don't think that, I don't see any Israeli leadership, even down the line, that is capable of this. And it reminds me of something that Nelson Mandela's grandson recently wrote. In a piece he published just about a couple of months ago, he wrote that allies of the anti-apartheid movement of the ANC never asked us to negotiate with our oppressors, with our colonizers. It was decolonization first. It was we get free first. Then what it looks like after that, what society, what government we're building after, it comes after we're free, not you force us to negotiate with our occupiers. And that takes me back to what I said in my original presentation, that we have to start a process of decolonization, and Israel needs to be forced into that, not with arms, but with boycott and sanctions. And I think that I honestly, and it's not bias, it's just what I've seen. There are, of course, Israelis that would accept it, but they're too few. But from what I've seen with Palestinians, I think that they would be more than ready to accept it and to work towards it. Not without some of the ones that would oppose it, but I think that they would be silenced by the great majority that would be hopeful of freedom.
We do need Mandela's, but Mandela did negotiate. Mandela became very fluent with the Afrikaner customs, practices, and beliefs. And he was able to convince them of trustworthiness. We need leaders like that, which we don't have, I'm afraid. Certainly not in Israel at the moment, and I'm not even sure among Palestinian leaders.
Oh, I would disagree. That on the Palestinian side, Israel has had for a long time Palestinians that were more than willing to make so many concessions and to bring the Palestinian society along with it. Concessions that I disagreed with, but a lot of Palestinians were willing to go along with it. But Israel did not want it. It did not fit into their idea of colonizing and maintaining the land. And this is why, again, I go back to, you have to decolonize. You're not negotiating between two equal parties that are arguing over a piece of land. No, it's a settler colonial project that has to be undone. And I think it's pretty clear. I'm not saying I'm very critical of Palestinian leaders, but it's not to say that Israel hasn't had a quote unquote partner that it could have made some kind of peace with.
So I want to apologize to Barbara Harvey. I may have misrepresented your question because I was trying to look at 14 different questions at the same time. But her question was about reflected concern about whether Palestinian life, society, and culture may be expected to survive in South African-style Bantustans in the West Bank, where they'd be vulnerable to bombing without any risk of injury or death to Israeli Jews living safely elsewhere in the West Bank. And I guess that was really more of a concern for you, Dr. Pearson, in terms of a demilitarized Palestinian state in a two-state scenario. But we haven't heard from Dr. Roth on this, so I'm going to go ahead and give you a little preference here to address any of these things that we've been talking about, since there's so many things, and then we can bounce it back around again.
Yeah, there are indeed so many things. One thing I want to address is BDS, because that hasn't been discussed in detail at this point. And this is another area where I have changed my perspective based upon how things have gone over time. Looking back to 1983, there was real reason to believe that there was a kind of conscience within the Israeli political community that could be tapped. When the Sabra and Shatila massacres took place in the fall of 1982, there were massive demonstrations against the government over that. You can find all kinds of fault with where people stood, even with respect to the Peace Now movement during that period. But there were serious forces that were concerned with human rights, with humanitarian law, with the way in which the banner of Zionism was being flown to rationalize atrocity. What is really striking is the change in the Israeli political community over time, reflected in the fact that in the next election, you may see the Israel Labor Party actually disappear from the Knesset, where you have, whereas half of the Israeli political community effectively represented labor Zionism back in the early 80s, and for the first 29 years, of course, that had dominated the entire political system. You have, maybe 6 seats out of 120 representing that strain of the original Zionist movement now. And so that has changed my view about the way in which we look about pressure from outside, because I was always concerned that BDS would tap into a certain kind of reflexive fear that people have, that people were being attacked for who and what they are rather than for what they do. And therefore, while I believed in boycotting goods from the occupied territories and so forth, I was resistant to the idea of BDS. I have largely dropped that resistance because I think that it is more important at this point to express resolve vis-a-vis the direction of Israeli policy than it is to try to appease that highly manipulated fear, given the extent of provocation and given things like the overwhelming support apparently for a nation state law that defies all kinds of universalist pretensions of the Zionist movement. So I have moved on that subject as well, I would say.
We're running short on time, so what I think I'd like to do, because you guys would not believe the amount of paper that's in front of me, and it's just impossible to talk and select out the questions there. But there was something here from Mike Friedman, and I think I'm just going to go ahead and address it to everybody. Well, actually, let me start with Huwaida, because you talked about decolonization, and I'd like, I think, what needs to be done in your point of view for something like that to move forward? And the premise of the question is coming from the statement that you made. How do you guys view that, or how do you view that?
Do you mean what constitutes we need to do right now to bring it about?
Well, I guess everybody has their imagination of an ideal future, and you've spoken about decolonization, and I think that maybe that's not a term that many people are familiar with or understand, or that it rests upon premises that many people reject, or maybe reject because they don't understand. So if you can clarify a little bit what that would look like under ideal circumstances, or whatever you would promote.
Right. I mean, just to keep it brief, because it is kind of a longer discussion, it would be a process. It would be a process that actually has to be figured out according to the solution. I think we can learn from other models and how things that worked and didn't work in other states. We mentioned here, I think I mentioned someone else did, Truth and Reconciliation Committees. I think we have to talk about, recognizing the harms that have been done, recognizing the incredible loss and injustices, and then starting to devise processes by which to reverse that. And that is going to take work. I think that it's never too early to put together actually a team that could start to design that. I don't have it laid out, but like here in the United States also, we're just now after 400 years talking about coming to terms with and addressing the US, really what this country did to African Americans. And although unfortunately reparations are still not seriously strongly being talked about, but coming to terms with over the last 400 years, what has happened. This country, it's been a long time, and I just learned of a team that's being put together to address what needs to be done to and what that might look like. And I think similar in our case, but I think before that, Israel has to be pressured to agree. It's not through negotiations and Israel deciding, what it will accept and what it will not accept. That's the thing. That's where all of us come in pushing in wherever we are, in our places of work, in our academic institutions, on the phone to our members of Congress, to put concrete pressure on Israel so that it has no other choice, so that Israeli civilians see that a better future for them, a better situation for them, a situation where they're no longer kind of isolated and looked at as pariahs, is to start working towards a better future where there's equality for all. So a long or short answer to your question is it's going to be a process that has to be figured out. But before that, there needs to be a strengthening of the campaign that is going to pressure Israel to really accept that this is how it has to be.
I appreciate the clarification, because it's not something that I personally have dealt in, and I'm sure there are viewers here who don't really understand the language of decolonization. And when you put it in terms that match what we're talking about in the United States.
Decolonization, Rabbi, can I point out that both peoples fought against the original colonizers, the British. Both of them resisted the British.
Yes.
And it's an irony, a tragedy that one has turned into a power over the other. But I think we need to get as far back toward the 67 lines as we can possibly get to erase the actual colonization that has taken place in the West Bank since that time, which is the acquisition and the holding on of territory won by warfare, which violates international law, and the occupation and violated international law. We can't, get away from that reality, I think, and we can't just gloss over it. I think we have to reverse that violation.
Can I just ask Professor Pearson one question, or Pearson, sorry. I hear you repeatedly advocating for 67 and 2 states, but does your vision then, okay, we get back to the 67 lines, that Israel is a state that is not defined as the state for the Jewish people or a Jewish state?
I don't think it's realistic to expect the Zionist movement in Israel to give up the notion of a Jewish state. Jewish homeland existed in the Balfour Declaration wording, and it was rejected by Zionist groups and movements. Now, to get back to that would be nice. We even had a decent arrangement under the Ottoman Empire where people had the millet system. It would be nice to get back to local homelands without having to have states, but I don't know that we can undo our state system at this point.
But basing what is fair and just on what the colonizer would accept, I don't think is a starter. And so that they might not accept it, that's what I'm talking about, sustained pressure that is going to make them accept the idea that Israel, whatever state that comes, it has to be a completely democratic state that does not grant preferences, based on religion you are, that does not grant rights on that basis. And so if
By the
you were
way,
talking
none of
about,
this
if you were
is actually
talking about two states where there's complete equality, everybody that lives in the borders of these two states, I would, you know, I don't know if I'd be fully on board with you, but at least I wouldn't oppose.
By the way, I don't see it as religion. I see it as nationalisms.
I think that's, I want to underscore that, and that is something that I do understand very well. I don't believe the Jews look at ourselves, that we look at ourselves as members of a religion. That certainly can't apply when you have an atheist rabbi moderating this discussion. It is a national, or at least a peoplehood issue. And knowing Israelis as well as I do, and Palestinians less so, what I have found is that the nationalism has become very entrenched. And it is extraordinarily difficult to ply this apart and to create some kind of modern nation state out of it when the attitude basically mirrors throughout Israel, mirrors what my professor, one of my teachers, who I've clearly rejected his teachings, but Rabbi Danny Gordis, who was Peter Beinart's podcast partner and frequent debating partner, he's called Peter Beinart a traitor to the Jewish people. That's extreme language. But those of us who are Jewish, you know, it would not hurt as much, it would not sting as much to be called a traitor to the Jewish religion, because every Jew betrays the Jewish religion in whatever way they want to. It's a badge of pride, actually. But this idea that we're betraying our people going back thousands of years and all of the narrative of that, what I've suggested, at least for American Jews, is that what I think that is important and possible right now is that they do what my congregation is doing, which is that when they teach what's happening in modern times in Israel, they need to provide the voices of both sides, because this is what we don't get enough of. We have so much emotion here, and much of it is generated by the inability to understand the other side. And I want to use Huwaida as an example of this. While she presents her personal and family's ideas, I happen to know, and you shared this with me when we met last time, and it's in your CV, that you were not at all lacking in understanding of what the Jewish world is about, because you sought it, you were educated in it. I think you majored in it even. So if we could have more of that in this country, I think that that the ability to at least begin to have some conversation on our side, so that is, and I mean the American side, so that when we talk to our politicians, that we have the understanding of what the other group is experiencing or has experienced, or at least how they perceived it, whether it's correct or not. And I'm being asked whether or not we teach the Nakba. We teach what Palestinians call the Nakba from their point of view, because we want a Palestinian point of view. And we teach what the Jews understand as being or the Israelis understand as being the gaining of their independence as being the truth from their point of view. And our major thrust is that at some point, two peoples with two very different ways of understanding the very same things that happen to them need to come together.
In the center, we hosted college students for 2 years from the Middle East, Arab communities, all across the Middle East, including Palestinians from Israel and then the territories. And we were the first group of State Department people, hosts, to take them to the Holocaust Museum, to take them to a Shabbat dinner at somebody's house. And they said they couldn't be photographed doing it, but they really liked doing it. And they really liked, making latkes and so forth. This is the kind of human person-to-person thing that needs to take place, because these two people have so much in common. They've both been diaspora. They're tremendously educated. They're technologically capable, and they've been hated by others in their midst for a long time. There is a grounding here of commonality, but we have to approach it in a way that they can let down their distrust and their bitterness.
Well, again, as an American Jew, all I can say is that we have a responsibility to make sure that our children understand what the Palestinians are saying. And I won't speak to the Palestinian community because I know them to be able to run their own community. But as a Jew, one of the things that disturbs me the most is I know I'm going to get, pardon my French, I'm going to get a lot of shit for being involved in this. And I don't care. Because as a humanistic Jew, I think it's very important for us to explore everything. And I want to thank all of you very much for making that easier for us tonight. And by making it easier, I mean presenting a lot of information that makes this much more difficult and much more challenging. So thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Matt to give closing thoughts for JVP and thank him for allowing my participation in this as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Rabbi Falick, and thank you to everyone, all of our panelists for their contributions in this important discussion. It's been a good and robust conversation. Just a few closing remarks. We have an upcoming event that, well, Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP Action has an upcoming event that many of you will surely be interested in. I'm going to post a link right now. Dismantling anti-Semitism, Winning Justice. It's a panel discussion, in fact, featuring Peter Beinart, along with Representative Rashida Tlaib, Barbara Ransby, and Mark Lamont Hill. That is next Tuesday, December 15th by Zoom. I'm going to post that right now. And I'm going to post one more time information about how you can become involved in our organization. We would love to be involved and work with anybody who's interested. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great week. Take care.